The long road home sky was gray that morning, and the air carried the faint smell of rain. Rajesh stood by the edge of the gas station, leaning on his old, beaten-up car. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stared at the pump. The numbers on the meter ticked higher, and he silently prayed they would stop before his card got declined inside the car. His daughter Mira was asleep in the back seat, her little hand clutching a torn teddy bear. She didn't know how close they were to empty again. Rajesh didn't want her to know. He had worked 3 jobs in the last year just to keep food on the table, but something always went wrong. Last month the transmission failed. Last week the fridge broke. And this morning his boss told him not to come back until business picked. He swiped his card at the pump. Declined. He swiped it again. Declined. He let out a long breath and leaned against the car dot. Just then, a quiet voice behind him said, "Having some trouble?" Rajesh turned. Standing, there was a man in a plain blue jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. Something about his face was familiar, but Rajesh couldn't place it. He forced a smile. "Just a little," Rajesh admitted. "I'll figure it out." The man tilted his head, studying Rajesh for a moment. Then he said, "Mind if I help?" Rajesh shook his head. "I appreciate it, but I don't take charity. I'll be fine." The man nodded, almost as if he respected the answer. Then he slipped his hands into his pockets and said softly, "Sometimes accepting help is its own kind of strength." Rajesh didn't know what to say to that dot. Then the man walked past him, swiped his own card at the pump, and began filling Rajesh's tank without another word. Rajesh stared at him, stunned. "You don't have to do that," he said. The man smiled faintly, but kept his eyes on the pump. "I know," he said. A few minutes later, the tank was full. The man put the nozzle back, handed Rajesh the receipt, and said, "Good luck out there." He started to walk away, but Rajesh called after him. "Wait, why are you doing this?" The man paused, glanced back over his shoulder, and for the first time, Rajesh saw his face clearly, and that's when he realized he had just met Sundar Pichai. Rajesh froze, his mouth slightly open. Sundar gave him a small nod, almost shy, and, "Son, you remind me of someone I used to know." Before Rajesh could say anything else, Sundar turned, got into a sleek black car parked by the curb, and drove away. Rajesh stood there, his mind racing. In the back seat. Mira stirred awake. "Daddy?" she murmured. He blinked, shook himself out of his daze, and forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Who was that man?" she asked. Rajesh hesitated. Then he whispered, "Just someone kind." But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of it. Something about the way Sundar had looked at him, as though he had a plan, made his heart pound. The next morning, Rajesh got a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a calm, professional voice said, "Please hold." For Mr. Pichai. Rajesh's legs went weak. He sank into a chair. After a few seconds, he heard Sundar's voice on the line. "Rajesh," Sundar said gently, "I hope I didn't scare you yesterday. I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." You didn't have to," Rajesh stammered. "No," Sundar replied, "but I wanted to." There was a pause. And Sundar said, "I was wondering, do you have time to meet me this afternoon?" "There's something I'd like to discuss." Rajesh swallowed hard. "Yes, of course." They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop downtown. Rajesh arrived early, his hands trembling, his shirt ironed for the first time in months. When Sundar walked in, people turned to look, but he ignored the stares and walked straight to Rajesh's table. "Thank you for coming," Sundar said, sitting down. Rajesh shook his head. "Thank you. I still don't understand why." Sundar held up a hand. "You will," he said. He leaned back in his chair, studying Rajesh with calm, thoughtful eyes. Then he began to tell a story. "Many years ago," Sundar said softly, "when I first came to this country, I was broke. I lived in a tiny apartment, ate instant noodles for dinner, and walked to work every day because I couldn't afford them. But one night, my shoes gave out, and it was raining, and I sat on a bench feeling like the biggest failure in the world. And then a stranger, handed me an umbrella and told me, "You're going to be just fine." Sundar's voice faltered for just a moment before he continued, "I never forgot that man. And I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd be the one handing out umbrellas." He smiled faintly. "Yesterday I saw you at that pump, and it reminded me." Rajesh listened quietly, his heart aching. "But," Sundar went on, "I'm not just here to fill your tank. I want to know your story. What are you dreaming of? What do you wish you could do for your daughter? For yourself?" Rajesh stared at the table, ashamed to speak. Then he whispered, "I just want her to have a chance. Better than I had. I wanted to open a repair shop someday. But that feels impossible now." Sundar nodded slowly as if he had expected that answer. Then he slid an envelope across the table. Rajesh stared at it. "What is this?" "A start," Sundar said simply. Rajesh opened it and gasped. Inside was a check for an amount so big his hands began to shake. "I can't take this," he said, pushing it back. But Sundar shook his head. "Yes, you can. Because this isn't charity. This is an investment, and I believe in you." Rajesh's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't speak. Sundar stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just promise me one thing," he said. Rajes looked up. "When the time comes," Sundar said softly, "you'll be the one handing out umbrellas." Rajesh nodded, his throat too tight to reply. As Sundar walked away, Rajesh sat there staring at the envelope, feeling like the whole world had shifted beneath his feet. But just as he tucked the check back into the envelope, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It said, "You don't know who you're dealing with. Give the money back." Now Rajes froze. He looked around the cafe, but everyone seemed normal. Then another message came in. "If you don't, you'll regret it." He felt a chill run down his spine. Outside the window, a dark car was parked across the street. And inside, behind tinted windows, someone was watching him. Asterisk shadows in the rain had started to fall by the time Rajesh stepped out of the cafe. He stood under the awning, clutching the envelope in his jacket pocket as though it were the only thing keeping him warm. His eyes darted to the dark car parked across the street. The windows were still tinted black, revealing nothing. But even through the curtain of rain, he could feel it. Someone inside was watching him. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. His stomach twisted into knots. He forced himself to look away. With deliberate calm, he walked down the street toward his car, though his legs felt heavy, shaky. The wet pavement gleamed under the dim streetlights, and his shoes splashed through shallow puddles. Behind him, he heard a car door open and close. His chest tightened. He didn't dare turn around. As he slid into his car and started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The dark car had pulled away from the curb and was following him now, its headlights distant but steady, like a predator keeping its distance before the strike. Rajesh gripped the steering wheel tighter and tried to think, who would send him such a message? Why would anyone threaten him over a gift, over kindness? His mind spun with questions, none of them with answers. He drove slowly through the quiet streets, pretending not to notice the car behind him. His thoughts raced back to the cafe, to Sundar's calm smile, his gentle words, the way he had said, "I believe in you." And yet, within minutes of that moment, someone else, someone unseen, wanted him to believe the opposite. Wanted him to feel afraid, small, powerless. When he finally reached the small, crumbling apartment where he lived with Mira, the rain was coming down harder, hammering against the windshield. He parked and looked once more in the mirror. The dark car had stopped at the corner. It didn't move. No one got out. He hurried inside, taking the stairs 2 at a time. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door and slipped inside. The apartment smelled faintly of curry and detergent. Mira was sitting on the floor with her coloring book, her teddy bear by her side. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Daddy," she chirped, her voice a bright note in the gloom. "You're wet." He forced a smile, his heart aching. "Just a little rain, sweetheart," he said. ruffling her hair. She went back to her coloring, content. But Resh stood by the window, staring out through the thin curtains. The car at the corner was gone now. It vanished, as though it had never been there. He pulled the envelope from his jacket and set it on the kitchen table. His fingers hovered over it. It felt heavier now than it had earlier, as though it carried not just money, but something darker, something invisible and sharp. He opened it again, staring at the check inside. The amount was still staggering. Enough to buy new shoes for Mira, fix the car, maybe even start that little repair shop he always dreamed of. He thought about what Sundar had said. This isn't charity. This is an investment. And yet the text messages echoed in his mind. You don't know who you're dealing with. Give the money back. Now, if you don't, you'll regret it. He closed the envelope, tucked it back into his pocket, and sat down at the table with his head in his hands. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dark car, the empty windows, the silent threat. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps outside the apartment door. But when he peeked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The next morning, he woke to another text message. Last warning. Meet me at Pier 17 at midnight. Come alone. Bring the envelope. Rajesh's blood went cold. He read the message over and over, his hands clammy. His first thought was to call Sundar, to tell him what was happening. But he didn't even have his number. Sundar had called him from an unknown line, and the cafe meeting had felt like a dream already, a brief light that had now given way to something darker. He tried to go through the day as normal for Mira's sake. He dropped her at school, pretending nothing was wrong. He went to the mechanic's shop where he worked part-time, turning wrenches, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of bolts and grease. But even there, he felt eyes on him, imagined shadows. In the corners, when the sun set and the streets emptied, he sat in his car at the edge of the pier. The water below was black and restless, waves slapping against the wooden beams. The fog hung low over the water, making everything seem far away and close all at once. At exactly midnight. A figure appeared at the end of the pier, tall, wearing a long coat, face hidden by the mist. Rajesh's throat tightened as he clutched the envelope. He stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the figure. As he got closer, he could see the man's eyes glinting faintly in the darkness. You got the money? The man asked, his voice low. Sharp. Who are you? Rajesh demanded, though his voice cracked slightly. You don't need to know that, the man replied. All you need to know is you're holding something that doesn't belong to you. Rajesh swallowed hard. This was a gift from Sundar Pichai. The man chuckled, though there was no humor in it. You really think someone like him gives something for nothing? You have no idea what you've stepped into. Rajesh felt his hands tremble around the envelope. What do you want? Give it back, the man said simply. Walk away. Pretend you never met him, or... The man let the silence stretch. In the distance, a gull cried out, its lonely sound swallowed by the fog. Or what? Rajesh whispered. Or you won't live long enough to regret it. Rajesh's jaw tightened. He thought of Mira, her tiny smile, her hopeful eyes, and something inside him hardened. He shook his head slowly. No, he said, his voice barely audible. The man's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake. Rajesh drew in a shaky breath but stood his ground. Maybe, but I promised her I'd never stop trying, and I'm not going to start now. The man stepped closer, and for a moment, Rajesh thought he might strike him. But instead, the man simply sneered, his breath white in the cold air. You're going to wish you'd listened, the man said. And then he turned and melted back into the fog, his footsteps fading into nothing. Rajesh stood there for a long time, staring out at the water. The wind whipped around him, biting through his jacket. He clenched the envelope tight in his fist. He didn't know what he had just gotten himself into. He only knew he couldn't let go now. When he finally returned to his car, he found something pinned under his windshield wiper. A single sheet of paper with just 3 words written on it in neat black ink. You were warned. His stomach churned as he looked around. But the pier was empty again. He crumpled the paper, shoved it into his pocket, and drove home through the quiet streets, every shadow on the sidewalk seeming to shift and move as he passed. When he walked into the apartment, Amira was asleep on the couch, the TV still glowing faintly. He sat down beside her and watched her for a long time, listening to her soft, even breathing. His phone buzzed once more. He flinched but picked it up this time. The message was different. You don't know me yet, but you're going to need my... Meet me tomorrow. Sunrise. Same cafe. Rajesh stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Who is this now? Friend? Enemy? He didn't know Dot, but as he sat there, the first rays of dawn beginning to seep through the window, he realized he didn't have a choice anymore. Something much bigger than him had begun the moment Sundar filled his gas tank. Dot, and now he was caught in it. Dot with trembling hands. He typed back a single word. OK. Asterisk. The stranger at sunrise. Sun had not yet fully risen. When Rajesh left the apartment the next morning, the city still slept under a soft gray haze, the streets quiet except for the occasional hiss of a passing bus. He walked with his hands in his pockets, the envelope pressed flat against his chest. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the last 2 days, the check, the man at the pier, the whispered threats had settled onto his shoulders all at once. When he reached the cafe, it was nearly empty. The lights inside cast a warm golden glow against the window, and wisps of steam curled from the mugs of the 2 early customers huddled by the corner. Rajesh hesitated outside, staring at the door. He thought of Mira, still asleep on the couch. When he'd left, her small body curled up like a question mark. His chest tightened. He whispered to himself, for her, and stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed softly, and the smell of fresh coffee and baked bread wrapped around him like a blanket. He scanned the room quickly. At first, he thought no one was there to meet him. Then he saw him, sitting at the same table where Sundar had sat just 2 days ago. The man was younger than Sundar, though there was something equally sharp about him. He wore a dark sweater and glasses, and his expression was unreadable. A single black notebook lay closed on the table in front of him. As Rajesh approached, the man looked up and nodded once, as though they had already met before. Rajesh, the man said, his voice low and calm. Sit down. Rajesh slid into the chair opposite him, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Who are you? The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to tell him. Then he said, you can call me Arjun. I work with people like you. Rajesh frowned. People like me? People who don't yet understand what they've stumbled into, Arjun replied, almost kindly. Rajesh's heart beat faster. Then tell me, what is this? What does Sundar have to do with it? And who is that man at the pier? Arjun leaned back, lacing his fingers together. What Sundar gave you, he began, was more than just a check. It was an invitation, and an obligation. He doesn't pick people at random, Rajesh. He chooses them because he sees something in them, something useful. But not everyone wants him to succeed in building whatever it is he's building. Rajesh stared at him, confused and a little afraid. What is he building? Arjun gave a small, tight smile. A future that scares the wrong people. He opened his notebook and slid it across the table. Rajesh glanced down. Inside was a photo of the man from the pier, his eyes hard and cold even in black and white. Beneath it was a name Rajesh didn't recognize and a list of dates and places that meant nothing to him. Who is he? Rajesh whispered. Someone who's been trying to stop Sundar for a long time, Arjun replied. And now he's trying to stop you. Rajesh shook his head, struggling to make sense of it. But why? I'm nobody. I fix cars. I take care of my daughter. I don't matter. Arjun's eyes softened just a little. You matter because Sundar believes. You matter, and that's enough to put you on the radar. Rajesh felt a chill run through him. His hands trembled as he asked, what do I do now? Arjun leaned forward, lowering his voice. You keep the envelope. Don't give it back. Don't meet him again. And don't trust anyone who approaches you from now on, except me. And maybe Sundar, if he reaches out again. Rajesh swallowed hard. What happens if I don't listen? Arjun didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the notebook slowly and tucked it into his bag. Then he looked directly into Rajesh's eyes and said, "You already know the answer." A silence fell between them, heavy and unspoken. Rajesh thought again of Mira, of her smile, of the way she had fallen asleep clutching her teddy bear. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll listen." Arjun stood up, smoothing his sweater. "Good," he said. "One more thing." Rajesh looked up. Arjun, single quotes S expression grew more serious. "There will come a moment when you'll have to choose between running and fighting. When that moment comes, don't run." With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Rajesh sitting alone at the table, his coffee untouched and growing cold. When Rajesh finally stood to leave, he noticed something odd. Folded neatly under his saucer was a small piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly. Written in neat, careful handwriting were 3 words. "He's watching." Rajesh's stomach turned to ice. He crumpled the note, stuffed it into his pocket, and hurried out the door. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. He kept glancing over his shoulder, jumping at shadows, flinching at the sound of car doors slamming in the distance. The world felt sharper now, more dangerous, as though everyone he passed could be hiding something behind their eyes. That evening he picked Mira up from school. She skipped alongside him, chattering about her day, about a picture she had drawn, about how she wanted pancakes for dinner. He forced himself to smile, to nod, to be present for her. But deep down, he felt the weight of eyes on him, watching even hear. When they reached the apartment, he froze at the door. The lock was slightly crooked, as though someone had forced it. He pushed the door open slowly, his heart in his throat. Inside, the apartment had been ransacked. The drawers were pulled out, the couch cushions slashed, the little bookshelf overturned. Mira gasped and clung to his leg, her eyes wide, and wet. On the wall, scrawled in red paint, were 4 words. Last chance. Midnight. Alone. Rajesh felt something in him break. Not from fear, but from anger. Someone had come into his home, into Mira's safe place, and tried to frighten him into submission. He crouched down, cupping Mira's face in his hands. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "We're going to be okay. I promise." She nodded, trusting him completely, after she fell asleep on what was left of the couch. Rajesh sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope in front of him. His hands hovered over it for a long time. Then, without another word, he slipped it into his jacket pocket and stood. He left the apartment quietly and walked out into the night. The city lights shimmered through the fog, and the streets were empty but alive with quiet danger. His mind replayed Arjun's words. There will come a moment when you'll have to choose between running and fighting. Don't run. He didn't intend to run. Not anymore. At 5 minutes to midnight, he stood again at the edge of the pier. The water below churned in the darkness, restless and cold. His breath misted in the air as he waited. Then a faint noise behind him, the crunch of a shoe on wet wood. He turned slowly, and there, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was the man from before. The one from the pier. The one with the cold eyes. This time he wasn't alone. 2 more figures stood behind him, both silent, both watching. The man stepped forward, his smile thin and cruel. "You should have listened," he said. But Rajesh didn't flinch. Not anymore. He straightened his back, his voice low but clear. "I did listen. I just chose to fight." The man's smile faded. "You really think you can win?" Rajesh reached into his pocket and gripped the envelope tightly. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he held the man's gaze. "Maybe not," Rajesh said quietly. "But I'm not afraid of you anymore." The man stared at him for a long moment, as though sizing him up, as though trying to decide if he was bluffing. Then he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Wrong answer," the man murmured. And then, without warning, he snapped his fingers. The 2 men behind him stepped forward. And everything happened at once. Dot one grabbed Rajesh's arm. The other lunged for the envelope. Rajesh struggled, shouting, twisting. The sound of water and wind roaring in his ears. Dot, and then a voice cut through the chaos. Calm, steady, familiar. That's enough. The world seemed to freeze. The men stopped. From the shadows, Sundar stepped into the light, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. He stood between Rajesh and the others now, his gaze hard as stone. Let him go, Sundar said, his tone quiet but commanding. The men hesitated, but the man with the cold eyes finally raised a hand. The others released Rajesh, and he stumbled. Back, breathing hard, Sundar turned his head slightly, his voice low and dangerous now. You've made your point, he said to the man. But if you touch him or his daughter again, you'll regret it. The man sneered but didn't reply. Instead, he stepped back into the fog, his two companions melting away with him. Rajesh stood there, shaking, his pulse still racing. Sundar glanced at him, his expression softening. You did well, Sundar murmured. Rajesh could barely find his voice. What is happening? Why are they doing this? Why me? Sundar looked out at the dark water for a long moment before answering. Because, he said quietly, you're stronger than you think, and they're afraid of that. He turned back to Rajesh, his eyes calm and resolute. But this isn't over, Sundar added. It's only just beginning. Asterisk. The choice night was colder than usual when Rajesh followed Sundar away from the pier. The fog swirled around them like a living thing, muffling the sounds of the restless water and the distant city beyond. They walked in silence at first, their footsteps echoing softly on the wooden planks. Rajesh felt his heart still racing from what had just happened. The struggle, the hands clawing at the envelope, the cruel smile of the man who had threatened his daughter's safety. But most of all, he felt the weight of Sundar's words still hanging in the air. This isn't over. It's only just beginning. Sundar led him to a quiet alley where a black car waited, sleek and silent under a single flickering street lamp. He opened the back door and gestured for Rajesh to climb in. For a moment, Rajesh hesitated. Everything inside him screamed that this was the moment, the line between the life he had known and the one he was now stepping into. He thought of Mira's sleeping face, her tiny hand clutching her teddy bear, and he forced himself to move. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Inside the car, it was warm and smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Sundar slid in beside him, and the driver pulled away without a word. The city lights streaked past the windows as they drove deeper into the heart of the city. You're angry, Sundar said softly. Breaking the silence at last. Rajesh stared down at his hands in his lap, his knuckles white. You said it was? An investment, he whispered, his voice rough. But you didn't tell me about all this? Sundar nodded slowly, as though he'd expected the question. I couldn't, he said. You wouldn't have believed me if I had. And you still wouldn't have walked away. Rajesh finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Who are they? He asked Dot for a long moment. Sundar didn't answer. Then he spoke in a tone lower, heavier than Rajesh had ever heard before. They are the ones who profit from keeping people like you down, Sundar said. The ones who build their power on fear and silence. They don't like when someone starts breaking the pattern. Even someone as small as you seems to them like a threat because it means someone else might wake up next. And then another, and another, until they have no more control left. His words sank deep into Rajesh's chest, sparking something there. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something hotter, sharper. But why me? Rajesh whispered. I'm nobody. Just a mechanic trying to take care of his kid. Why would they care about me? Sundar's expression softened, though his eyes still burned with quiet intensity. Because you refuse to give up, he said simply. And that's the one thing they can't stand. The car slowed and finally stopped in front of a tall, modern building of glass and steel. Sundar opened his door and stepped out, waiting for Rajesh to follow. Inside, the air was cool and hushed, the faint hum of hidden machinery somewhere beyond the polished walls. They rode an elevator to the very top, where a pair of massive doors opened into a room that seemed to float above the city itself. It was a breathtaking space, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the skyline below, the stars above, and the wide table at the center with papers and screens glowing softly. This is where it begins, Sundar said, gesturing to the table. Rajesh stood there awkwardly, still clutching the envelope, feeling out of place amid the quiet grandeur. Sundar walked over to one of the windows, his hands clasped behind his back. You've already made a choice, Sundar said, his reflection faint in the glass. But now you need to make another. Rajesh frowned. What do you mean? You can keep the money and go back to your life, Sundar said. Try to rebuild. Pretend none of this ever happened. They'll still come for you sometimes. They'll try to scare you. But eventually they'll forget you, and you'll survive. He turned then, his eyes locking on Rajesh's. Or, Sundar continued, you can work with me. Help me build something better. Not just for you and your daughter, but for everyone like you. It will be dangerous. You'll be a target. You'll be tested in ways you can't yet imagine. But you'll have a chance to make a difference. Rajesh swallowed hard. His mind was spinning. The idea of just taking the money and disappearing tempted him. The thought of Mira safe, of quiet mornings and peaceful nights. But another part of him, buried deep, remembered the man's cruel smile at the pier, the words scrawled in red on his wall, and how powerless he had felt in that moment. Why would you want me? He asked finally, his voice quiet, a faint smile. Touch Sundar's lips. Because I see what they see, he said. And it scares them. Rajesh stood there, gripping the envelope tightly, his thoughts racing. Outside the windows, the city lights blinked and shimmered like 1,000 watchful eyes. Finally, he looked up. What would you have me do? Sundar's smile deepened just a little, not triumphant, but approving. First, he said, you'll learn who they really are, and then you'll learn how to stop them. He walked over to the table and pressed a button. One of the screens came alive, displaying photos, documents, maps covered in names and lines connecting them. Rajesh stepped closer, feeling a chill as he recognized the man from the pier among the faces. This is the network, Sundar explained. They control more than you can see. But they're not invincible. Every system has weak points. You'll help me find them. Rajesh stared at the screen, feeling the heat rise in his chest again. Not fear this time, but something closer. To resolve got, just then, one of the other screens blinked and a loud chime sounded in the room. Sundar's expression darkened as he leaned over and read the message that appeared. They've moved faster than expected. He knows you're here before? Rajesh could ask what that meant. The lights in the room flickered. The faint hum of the machinery cut out abruptly, leaving the space eerily silent except for the faint crackle of static from the screens. Sundar straightened, his eyes narrowing as he whispered, They found us. Without another word, he strode toward a hidden door at the far end of the room. Come with me, he said sharply. Rajesh followed, his pulse pounding, the envelope still clutched in his hand like a lifeline. Beyond the door was a narrow stairwell that spiraled down into darkness. The air grew cooler as they descended, and the sound of distant sirens began to reach them through the concrete walls. When they finally emerged at the bottom, they found themselves in an underground garage. But it wasn't empty. Standing between them and the exit was the man from the pier, this time surrounded by 4 others, all dressed in black, their faces hidden. The man's smile was wider now, though just as cruel. You should have walked away, he called out. Rajesh froze, his breath catching in his throat, but Sundar didn't stop walking. He moved slowly but deliberately toward the group, his presence somehow filling the entire space. You still don't understand, Sundar said, his voice carrying through the garage. He's already chosen. The man's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then chaos. The 4 figures lunged forward all at once, and Rajesh barely had time to react. Before Sundar was already moving, faster than Rajesh thought possible. The sound of fists meeting flesh, of boots scuffing concrete, echoed through the garage as Sundar fought them back with a precision and calm that was almost terrifying. One of the figures broke past him and charged at Rajesh. For a split second, fear gripped him, but then he remembered Sundar's words. Don't run. He tightened his grip on the envelope and swung it hard at the man's head, catching him off guard. The man stumbled, and Rajesh followed up with his shoulder, driving him to the ground. His heart pounded, but for the first time, he felt something bloom in his chest, the sense that he was no longer powerless. When the dust settled, the man from the pier was gone. The others lay scattered across the floor, groaning softly, defeated. Sundar straightened, adjusting his jacket as though nothing had happened. He glanced at Rajesh, a faint smile of approval on his lips. Not bad, he said. Rajesh stood there, panting, staring at the envelope in his hand. He realized now it wasn't just money anymore. It was a choice he had already made, but then, as they made their way toward the exit, Sundar's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his smile vanished. What is it? Rajesh asked. Sundar's jaw tightened. They have Mira, he said quietly. The words hit Rajesh like a punch to the gut. He froze, his knees nearly buckling, before rage and fear surged through him in equal measure. Where? He demanded, his voice low and shaking. Sundar single, quotes S eyes, met his, steady and unflinching. We'll get her back, he said. But you need to be ready for what comes next. Asterisk, the heart of the storm. Rajesh stood frozen in the middle of the garage, the echo of Sundar's words still ringing in his ears. They have Mira. For a few seconds, everything around him seemed to dissolve. The faint smell of oil and dust, the soft groans of the men on the floor. Even Sundar's steady presence faded into the background. All he could see was Mira's face, her little fingers clutching his sleeve, her voice calling him Daddy as. She fell asleep, and now she was in the hands of the same people who had painted threats on his walls, who had grabbed at him in the dark, who had tried to break him at the pier. Where is she? Rajesh whispered, his voice rough, barely holding back the panic rising in his chest. Sundar didn't answer right away. He was still staring down at his phone, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his jaw unmistakable. Then, finally, he looked up. They sent me coordinates, he said. An abandoned factory on the outskirts. It's not far, but... He paused, his eyes narrowing. They'll be expecting us. Rajesh's fist tightened at his sides. Then we don't make them wait, he said, his voice firmer than he thought possible. Sundar studied him for a moment, something like approval flickering in his eyes. Then he nodded once. Come on, he said. They climbed into the car again, and this time there was no silence. Sundar spoke as the city fell away behind them, his tone calm but quick, like someone who had done this before. When we get there, he said, you stay close to me. Don't let them separate us. They'll try to scare you, confuse you, make you believe you've already lost. Don't listen to them. Don't let them see your fear. Rajesh stared out the window, the dark streets rushing by, lights blurring into streaks. And if they hurt her, he asked quietly. Sundar's hands tightened on the steering wheel. They won't, he said simply. The factory loomed ahead like a dark skeleton against the night sky. Its windows were broken, its walls covered in faded graffiti. The wind whistled through the cracks, carrying with it the faint smell of rust and damp concrete. The car rolled to a stop just outside the gate, its headlights cutting a pale path through the fog. They stepped out together, and the crunch of gravel under their feet sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. Sundar moved with quiet purpose, but Rajesh could feel his own heartbeat hammering in his chest. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner full of unseen eyes inside. The air was colder. Broken glass crunched underfoot. The faint drip of water somewhere above echoed through the vast, empty space. And then, ahead of them, a faint light dot as they moved closer. Rajesh's stomach twisted. Mira was there, sitting in a chair in the middle of the room, her hands tied, her eyes wide. With fear, standing behind her, as if waiting for them, was the man from the pier. He smiled when he saw them, but it was a smile without warmth. You should have walked away, the man said softly, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Rajes, single quotes, as breath caught in his throat, but Sundar stepped forward first. Let her go, he said, his tone even, deadly calm. The man chuckled. You think it's that easy? He asked. You've been a thorn in my side long enough, Sundar. And now you've dragged him into this too. He gestured at Rajesh. With a flick of his hand. You think he has what it takes? You think he's like you? He's nothing. Rajesh felt something sharp and hot flare up in his chest at those words. But before he could move, Sundar spoke again. You've made your point, Sundar said, his voice still low but carrying an edge now. You've tried fear, threats, violence, but here we are. Still standing. So what now? The man's smile faded and his eyes hardened. Now, he said, you watch everything you care about fall apart. And then he reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. Rajesh's body moved before his mind could catch up. He lunged forward, shoving Sundar aside and barreling toward the man. The world seemed to narrow to a single point, Mira's wide, frightened eyes as he collided with the man, knocking him backward. The knife skittered across the floor. The two of them crashed to the ground, grappling in the dust and broken glass. Rajesh felt pain blossom in his shoulder, his ribs, but he didn't stop. Every punch, every desperate shove was fueled by months, years of quiet anger, of humiliation, of being told he was nobody. Finally, with a roar that startled even himself, Rajesh slammed the man back against the floor, pinning him. You don't touch my daughter, he hissed, his voice shaking with rage. Behind him, Sundar had already moved to untie Mira. She clung to him for a moment, then ran to Rajesh, throwing her arms around his neck. Gaddy, she sobbed, her tiny body trembling. He held her close, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It's okay, he whispered into her hair. You're okay. I've got you. Sundar stood over the man, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Rajesh. We need to go, he said. Now. Rajesh got to his feet, still holding Mira, his body aching, but his heart steady. They moved quickly out of the factory, the cold night air biting at their skin as they made their way back to the car. As the car sped away from the factory, Rajesh sat in the back seat with Mira curled up against him, her breathing slowly evening out. He stared out the window, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. He did well, Sundar said quietly from the front seat. Rajesh didn't reply right away. He glanced down at Mira, then back out at the dark city rushing past. Finally, he asked, is it over? Sundar's silence stretched for a few moments before he answered. Not yet, he said. Rajesh closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. Then tell me what comes next. The faintest hint of a smile touched Sundar's lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. What comes next, he said, is your real test. They drove in silence after that, the weight of those words settling over Rajesh like a storm cloud. He didn't know what the test would be or how much more he could endure, but as he looked down at Mira sleeping in his arms, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop now. When they finally reached a quiet, hidden safe house on the edge of the city, Sundar led them inside. The air was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke. There were no windows, only heavy curtains and sturdy locks on the doors. Sundar handed Rajesh a small envelope, thinner than the first, and said, read this when you're ready. It will explain everything. Rajesh took it wordlessly and sat down on the edge of the bed with Mira still asleep against his chest. Sundar stood in the doorway for a moment longer before saying, almost to himself, you've come further. And I thought you would. Then he was gone, leaving Rajesh alone with the faint hum of the heater and the sound of Mira's breathing. He stared at the envelope in his hand for a long time before he finally tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and it was a name he didn't recognize. Location. And 3 simple words. Finish what we started. Rajesh folded the paper slowly, his fingers trembling. He didn't know where this path would lead or if he'd even survive it, but he knew now there was no turning back.